The story of the Cullen Baker gang does not begin with gunfire, bloodshed, or fame. It begins long before the Wild West came to fear the name Cullen Baker. It begins with a quiet, troubled boy growing up in a harsh land where survival shaped every soul. And as he walked through life, step by step, that boy slowly changed into a man whose shadow would one day stretch over Texas and Arkansas like a dark storm. Cullen Montgomery Baker was born in Tennessee in 1835, during a time when families lived far from towns, far from safety, and far from the law. When he was still a young child, his parents moved the family to East Texas, a wild and dangerous territory. Back then, Texas was a place filled with conflict. Arguments turned into fights. Fights turned into killings. The sound of gunfire was as normal as the sound of wind blowing across the fields. Cullen grew up, watching men settle problems with weapons instead of words. He watched neighbors carry old grudges for years. He saw people fight over land, cattle, and pride. And he learned early that the one who struck first was often the one who survived. This world shaped him. It taught him harsh lessons before he was even old enough to understand them. As a boy, Cullen had a quick temper. People remembered that he could go from calm to furious in a moment. He had a sharp tongue, and he didn't back down from anyone. Some said he was just spirited. Others whispered he had a darkness inside him, but no one could predict the man he would become by the time he reached his teenage years. Cullen had already developed a reputation. He drank too much, fought too often, and acted without thinking about the consequences. In frontier towns, young men sometimes got into trouble, but Cullen's troubles were different. They were bigger, louder, and always more dangerous. One night, everything changed forever. Cullen had been drinking heavily, as he often did, and he got into a heated argument with a man at a gathering. Voices rose, tempers flared, and in a split second, Cullen reached for his weapon. Shots echoed through the dark. When the smoke cleared, a man lay dead at Cullen's feet. Whether it was self-defense or rage didn't matter. What mattered was that a line had been crossed, one that he could never return from. That killing marked the beginning of a new life for him. A life filled with anger, violence, and fleeing from the law. It pushed him into a future where fear and death followed close behind. But fate had more in store for Cullen than just bar fights and small crimes. Soon, the entire country was about to change. The Civil War erupted, tearing families apart and setting entire regions on fire. The war brought chaos, and chaos was something Cullen understood better than most. It was the perfect environment for a man like him. When the war began, Cullen did not join the regular Confederate Army. Instead, he joined irregular forces guerrilla fighters who operated in the shadows. These men didn't march in formation or follow strict rules. They moved fast, struck without warning, and vanished into the woods before anyone could respond. It was a world of ambushes, night raids, and silent kills, and Cullen thrived in it. The war deepened the darkness inside him. He became known for his fierce bravery in battle, but also for his cruelty. He fought with intensity, driven by a mix of anger, liquor, and a desire to prove himself. People who rode beside him respected his skill, but they also feared his violent temper. Even among rough fighters, Cullen stood out. When the war finally ended in 1865, most men put away their guns and tried to rebuild their lives. But Cullen Baker was not like most men. Peace did not interest him. He felt lost, angry, untamed. The war had changed him, and there was no place for a man like him in quiet, peaceful farmland. So instead of returning home and living a normal life, Cullen did something else, something that would shape his legend forever. He turned to outlaw life. The law was weak in the years after the war. Towns were rebuilding. Soldiers had gone home. Government forces struggled to control large territories filled with desperate and angry men. Cullen saw an opportunity, and slowly he gathered others like him men who could not let go of the war. Men who felt they no longer belonged in society. Men who were willing to kill without hesitation. These men became the early seeds of what the world would soon call the Cullen Baker Gang. At first, their actions were small, stealing horses, robbing travelers, intimidating local communities, but as their confidence grew, so did their violence. Cullen became their natural leader, not because he was wise, but because he was fearless, unpredictable, and terrifying. Locals began whispering about him again. They said he could vanish into the forest like a ghost. They said he was a master of ambush, a man who never hesitated, a man who killed as easily as he breathed. And slowly, the name Cullen Baker spread across the region, carried on stories told by frightened travelers and shaken soldiers. But what most people didn't know was this. Cullen was not just building a gang. He was building a legacy, one shaped by anger, fear, and violence. A legacy that would make him one of the most feared outlaws of the Wild West. The boy who had once stood in the Texas sun, watching fights break out in dusty fields, had become a man the entire region whispered about. A man who had crossed too many lines to ever return. A man whose story was only beginning. Because for Cullen Baker, the real darkness was still to come. When the Civil War ended in 1865, most men walked away from battle with relief. They were tired, broken, and ready to return home to their families. But Cullen Baker was not like the others. For him, the war had not ended. It only changed shape. The battlefield around him disappeared, but the battlefield inside him stayed alive. And as the smoke of war settled over Texas and Arkansas, Cullen found himself searching for a new enemy, a new purpose, and a new outlet for the violence that had become part of him. The land he returned to was unfamiliar. Homes were burned. Families were grieving. Many men had died. The world he once knew as a young boy had been replaced by a world of loss and confusion. The Confederacy was gone. The Union now controlled everything. Federal agents and soldiers patrolled the roads. Freedmen, former enslaved people, were beginning new lives, and emotions were tense everywhere. In this new world, Cullen Baker felt like a stranger. He did not fit into peaceful life. He did not want to work the fields, raise animals, or rebuild the family farm. A fire still burned inside him, a fire fed by anger, fear, and memories of war. And it was only a matter of time before that fire spread. The first sparks began quietly. Cullen started spending his nights drinking, wandering from one campfire to another, drifting between small communities, always restless. People noticed that the war had changed him. His eyes looked colder. His temper was sharper. He spoke less, but acted faster. Those who knew him said he seemed haunted like a man walking beside the ghost of his own past. But chaos was not far away. The Reconstruction period that followed the war was filled with conflict. Many Southerners felt angry and powerless. Union soldiers tried to enforce new laws. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to protect newly freed African Americans, and violent confrontations became common throughout the region. Cullen saw this chaos as opportunity. He watched as arguments turned into fights. Fights turned into riots, and entire communities dissolved into fear. And he understood something others did not. The law was stretched thin, almost useless. There were too few soldiers, too few officers, and too many angry men. Cullen knew that in this environment, a determined outlaw could rise faster than ever before. That is when Cullen took his first step toward becoming the legend people would never forget. He began meeting with former Confederate soldiersmen who, like him, had lost everything. Some were angry. Some were desperate. Some just didn't know how to return to peaceful life. Cullen spoke to them, drank with them, listened to their frustrations, and slowly won their trust. One by one, these men started riding with him. At first, they were just a loose group of drifters looking for trouble. But Cullen had something they didn't: fearlessness. He wasn't afraid to confront Union officials. He wasn't afraid to stand against authority. He carried his temper like a weapon, and soon men followed him, not because they liked him, but because they feared the man he was becoming. Small crimes became big crimes. A stolen horse became a stolen wagon. A fistfight became a gunfight. A quarrel with a soldier became an ambush. Cullen discovered he had a talent for surprise attacks. He knew the swamps, the forests, and the narrow river trails better than almost anyone else in the region, and he used this knowledge to strike targets quickly and disappear before anyone could react. Union patrols started reporting a nameless rider who attacked without warning. Freedmen traveling along the roads spoke of a dangerous group hiding in the brush. Families whispered that Cullen Baker was becoming something darker than an outlaw. He was becoming a ghost of the war that refused to end. It wasn't long before this group of riders earned a name: the Cullen Baker Gang. Their early days were scattered and disorganized, but Cullen's natural leadership and his violent determinations slowly shaped them into a force that terrified communities across Texas and Arkansas. They struck mostly at night, moving like shadows through forests. They ambushed wagons, raided small settlements, and targeted Union officials. Their attacks were quick, brutal, and difficult to predict. They never stayed in one place for long. They never left clear trails, and they rarely left witnesses. Local law enforcement struggled to respond. Sheriffs had too few deputies. Soldiers had too little control, and the terrain itself worked against them. Thick swamps, muddy riverbanks, and dense forests made pursuit nearly impossible. For ordinary people living in the region, the fear was constant. A farmer riding home at dusk didn't know if he might be ambushed. A soldier on patrol didn't know if he would make it through the night. A traveler crossing the Sulphur River prayed his path wouldn't cross with the gangs. The name Cullen Baker began spreading from town to town like a frightening rumor. Some compared him to an animal or predator hiding in the shadows. Others said he was a war demon left behind after the fighting ended. And some, particularly those still loyal to the Confederate cause, whispered that he was a hero resisting federal control. The truth was simpler. Cullen Baker was a man who had lost his place in the world, and in his desperation, he created a world where violence made him feel powerful again. As the gang grew, so did Cullen's personal legend. Men claimed he could ride through a swamp without leaving tracks. Some said bullets could not kill him. Others swore he could sense danger before it happened. These stories were exaggerated, but they added to his aura. Fear did half the work for him. By the end of 1866, the Cullen Baker gang was no longer just a group of angry former soldiers. They were a fully formed outlaw gang that lawmen feared and newspapers began warning the public about. Cullen Baker had transformed from a troubled young man to a figure of terror. Yet beneath all the fear, one truth remained. Cullen Baker was still human. He still wrestled with his own demons. He still searched for something: power, purpose, maybe even redemption. But the path he was walking was leading him somewhere darker. Somewhere his enemies were growing. Somewhere even he would not be able to escape. Because Cullen Baker's story was not just about violence. It was about destiny and how a man shaped by war can become a prisoner of his own rage. And the worst was yet to come. The rise of the Cullen Baker gang did not happen overnight. It grew slowly, like a storm far away on the horizon. At first, no one noticed it. Then, people began to sense a change in the air, and by the time the storm reached their towns, it was already too late to escape it. By late 1866, Cullen Baker had become more than just a troubled ex-soldier. He had become the leader of a growing circle of desperate men. Some were former Confederate fighters. Others were drifters with no home or family. A few were simply criminals looking for a leader who was bold enough or dangerous enough to follow. Cullen didn't pick these men for their morals or their skills. He picked them because they were like him, angry, restless, and unable to return to a quiet life. They were men who didn't belong anywhere except on horseback, with guns on their hips and trouble in their hearts. The gang found their playground in a region known as the Sulphur River bottoms, a maze of swamps, thick forests, muddy banks, and hidden trails. To ordinary people, the place was a nightmare. To Cullen Baker, it was home. He knew every curve of the river, every patch of swamp that swallowed footprints, every narrow trail that could hide a rider or an entire gang. It was this knowledge that allowed Cullen to carve out a kingdom in the wilderness, a place where no lawman could easily follow. As weeks turned into months, the Cullen Baker gang began to take shape. The men rode under Cullen not because he was wise or calm, but because he was fearless. His courage wasn't heroic, it was reckless. It bordered on madness, and that kind of fearlessness inspired other dangerous men to join him. The gang's early activities were chaotic. Some days they robbed travelers. Other days they harassed Union soldiers or attacked Freedmen's Bureau agents. Sometimes they simply rode into a small settlement, fired shots into the air, and disappeared again just to remind people they existed. Their unpredictability is what made them terrifying. Their silence afterward is what made them mysterious. People didn't know where they would strike next. People didn't know why they struck at all. For Cullen, there was no grand strategy. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to feed the anger inside him, and the gang became the weapon. He used to strike at the world, But as their crimes grew bolder, something else began to happen. Stories began to spread at first. They were simple warnings. Don't travel after dark. Stay off the Sulphur River Trail. If you hear horses in the woods, hide. But soon, the stories began to change. People exaggerated what they saw, added details they imagined, and created legends where there were none. Suddenly, Cullen Baker wasn't just an outlaw. He was a ghostly figure who could vanish in the night, a demon rider whose bullets never missed, a man whose temper could freeze the blood of anyone who looked at him wrong. Cullen didn't try to correct these stories. He enjoyed them. He encouraged them. Fear, he understood, was more powerful than any gun. One night, a small group of Union soldiers was patrolling near the river. They had heard rumors about Cullen Baker, but didn't take them seriously. They believed the stories were tales told by frightened civilians. Nothing more. As they rode through a narrow trail, they noticed the silence, too much silence. No birds, no insects, only the faint sound of water dripping. And then, without warning, gunfire tore through the darkness. The soldiers fell before they even saw where the shots were coming from. The attackers were shadows behind trees, figures hidden in the brush. By the time the ambush ended, the ground was covered with broken branches, blood, and confusion. The gang disappeared into the forest as quickly as they had arrived. The next morning, people whispered again. It was Cullen. He strikes without warning. He kills like he's still in the war. News of the ambush reached military officials, who tried to track the gang. But every time soldiers thought they had found a lead, the trail vanished into the mud or dissolved in the swamp. Cullen's territory seemed alive, shifting, hiding him from his enemies. As the months passed, the gang grew in numbers and confidence. Raids became more organized, attacks more coordinated. Cullen was no longer just the angriest man in the gang. He was its brain, its voice, its spark. Yet behind the violence, something deeper was growing inside him. Paranoia, he began to suspect betrayal in every shadow. He watched his own men with narrowed eyes. He distrusted their laughter, their private conversations, their long stares at him after a raid. Cullen believed that as long as he kept moving, kept striking, kept frightening the world, no one could touch him. But paranoia has a way of controlling a person. It changes the way they speak, the way they ride, the way they sleep. Cullen's temper, once loud and explosive, began to mutate into something colder and more dangerous. He punished small mistakes. He argued over nothing. He threatened men who had followed him for months. And the more violent he became, the more his gang feared him, not just as a leader, but as a man who could turn on them at any moment. Still, they stayed. Why? Because riding with Cullen Baker guaranteed one thing: power. Men who followed him walked into towns, and people trembled. They crossed rivers, and travelers turned their horses around. They approached settlements, and doors shut silently. Fear gave them authority. Cullen gave them direction, and violence held them together. But deep inside, Cullen Baker's greatest enemy was not the law, the soldiers, or the communities terrified by his name. His greatest enemy was himself. The war had taken something from him that he never regained. Peace was impossible for him. Stillness felt like weakness. And the more he tried to outrun his demons, the stronger they became. By the end of 1867, the Cullen Baker gang had become one of the most feared outlaw groups in the entire region. But fear came with a price. And somewhere in the shadows, forces were beginning to gather against him. Because when a man becomes a storm, there will always be someone waiting for the moment it breaks. By early 1867, the Sulphur River region lived in a constant state of fear. People did not ride alone anymore. Families refused to travel after sunset, and every whisper in the dark, every distant hoofbeat, every rustle in the night carried the same terrifying possibility. It might be Cullen Baker. What had once been a scattered group of angry ex-soldiers was now a fully formed outlaw organization. They were unpredictable, violent, and loyal only to Cullen's rage. Together, they ruled the woods and river crossings like wolves, guarding their territory. The Cullen Baker gang had become more than a band of criminals. They had become a force shapeless, silent, and always watching. And at the center of this force was Cullen himself, a man growing darker with each passing day. The gang's most frightening talent was their ability to attack without warning. They struck quickly, using the land as their ally. The Sulphur River was a tangle of muddy banks, twisted trees, hidden pools, and dense brush. For most people, it was a dangerous maze. For Cullen, it was a weapon. He knew where the ground was firm enough for horses, where the trails were narrow enough to force travelers to slow down, and where he could hide a dozen men without a single blade of grass seeming out of place. These ambushes became the gang's signature. A soldier riding alone might hear nothing at all before bullets exploded through the trees. A freedman walking home at dusk might see shadows move just once before everything went dark. A wagon carrying supplies might round a quiet bend in the trail and never emerge on the other side. The gang disappeared into the woods before anyone could react. By the time help arrived, all that remained were hoofprints fading into the mud. The violence was not just shocking, it was unpredictable. No pattern, no warning, no mercy. This unpredictability made the gang more terrifying than larger outlaw groups. You could avoid a well-known bandit trail. You could avoid a known saloon where criminals gathered, but you could not avoid the shadows. And the Cullen Baker gang lived in the shadows. Cullen Baker was not a man who enjoyed planning. He enjoyed action. He was quick to anger, quick to fight, and quicker to pull a gun. His temper was so fierce that even some men in his own gang admitted they rode with him out of fear rather than loyalty. But Cullen had two constant companions, more dangerous than any gang member. War and whiskey. War had shaped him. Whiskey pushed him. His drinking grew heavier with each raid. Some nights he wandered alone into the forest, drunk enough to stumble, angry enough to break anything he touched. He often returned to camp with wild eyes and shaking hands, claiming he saw Union patrols stalking him or rival outlaws, spying on him. His paranoia was no longer a whisper, had become a roar. He trusted almost no one, not even the men who slept beside him under the same cold sky. But even in his drunken spirals, the gang followed him, because despite his flaws, Cullen Baker had something that no outlaw around him could match: a talent for survival. He could ride through a swamp that would drown other men. He could escape a posse by disappearing into the fog. He could sense danger with an instinct sharpened by years of violence. These qualities made him unpredictable and unstoppable. One of the main reasons the gang grew in notoriety was their willingness to attack Union soldiers during Reconstruction. Many outlaws robbed banks, many stole cattle, but attacking federal forces after a major war, that was something different. It was reckless. It was deadly. It was political. To some Southerners, it looked like resistance. To federal authorities, it was terrorism. Cullen didn't care about politics. His hatred for Union authority was personal. Rooted in his anger from the war, he saw every patrol as a symbol of the world that defeated him, and the gang followed him into these battles, even when they were outnumbered. Soldiers began requesting larger patrols. Officers warned their men to avoid the Sulphur River region unless necessary. Reports described a ghostwriter who attacked like a flash of lightning. And behind every story was the same name: Cullen Baker. Some outlaws dream of wealth, some dream of fame. Cullen Baker dreamed of control. Chaos made him feel alive. It was the only world he felt he understood. He rode at night with no destination, returning only when he felt the need to remind the world he existed. He fired his guns into the air, yelled curses at the wind, and drank until the world around him blurred into colors he didn't recognize. His gang feared him during these nights. Men whispered, "He's not just dangerous, he's unpredictable. He might kill us before the law ever catches him. He's losing his mind." And although they feared him, they followed him, because Cullen Baker represented everything they felt to enjoy: confusion, loss, and a desperate desire to feel powerful in a world that had changed too quickly. But power built on fear can never last forever. Word of the gang spread faster than their horses could ride. Local newspapers began printing bold headlines: "Baker strikes again. Devil Rider of the River Bottoms. Terror in Northeast Texas." Reporters exaggerated details. They added dramatic twists. They turned Cullen into a myth larger than life. Some said he moved with supernatural speed. Others said bullets bounced off him. One article claimed he could hit a target in pitch darkness. The stories made the public tremble, but they also did something else. They made Cullen Baker famous. Notorious, hated, admired, feared. His reputation grew beyond anything reality could contain, and the bigger his legend became, the more determined the authorities were to end it. As the gang's crimes increased, law enforcement realized they could no longer ignore the problem. They began forming posses. They held emergency town meetings. They planned raids. They watched the river dot. But every time they thought they had cornered Cullen, he vanished. It was as if the land itself protected him. Yet even as he outsmarted his enemies, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something Cullen did not see and could not control. The gang was growing restless. Suspicion was poisoning their ranks. Rivalries were forming, and betrayal was quietly taking root. Because when a gang rises fast, it can fall even faster, and Cullen Baker was riding toward a future he could not escape. By the summer of 1867, the name Cullen Baker had spread far beyond the Sulphur River bottoms. His reputation was no longer just local whispers passed from frightened families to cautious travelers. It had become a wildfire burning across Texas and Arkansas. Every new raid, every fresh ambush, every report of a patrol disappearing in the woods added fuel to the flames. The man who once drifted through life with reckless anger had transformed into a symbol of terror. The legend of the Cullen Baker gang grew larger than the man himself, and soon the entire region seemed to be living under the shadow of his violence. Newspapers printed his name in bold letters. Posters nailed to tree trunks offered rewards for his capture. Soldiers stationed at remote outposts whispered the stories they heard in nearby towns. One thing was clear. Cullen Baker was no longer just an outlaw. He was a problem the authorities could no longer ignore. Whenever a story about Cullen Baker appeared in the newspaper, it seemed to grow in size with each retelling. Some articles described him as a devil on horseback. Others claimed he led a band of killers, so quiet that victims never saw or heard them before it was too late. A few newspapers tried to stay factual, but those stories never gained attention. People wanted drama. Fearing the legend of Cullen Baker delivered exactly that. Each story added another layer to his myth. He shoots faster than any man alive. He rides through swamps without leaving tracks. He can disappear into thin air. Bullets don't kill him, they only make him angrier. These exaggerations weren't accurate, but they didn't need to be. They served a purpose. They gave people a villain to fear and the government an enemy to pursue. But behind all the terrifying tales, Cullen remained simply a man, driven by anger and haunted by the war's ghosts. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't supernatural. He was human. And that made him even more dangerous, because humans make mistakes. And some mistakes are fatal. As Baker's crimes spread across state lines, the federal government stepped in. Rewards were offered. Notices were printed and sent to every sheriff's office across Texas and Arkansas. The reward posters didn't just ask for him. They demanded him. Wanted. Cullen Montgomery Baker, dead or alive. The bounty increased almost monthly. At first, it was a small sum, just enough to catch the attention of bounty hunters and desperate men. But as the gang continued its attacks, the reward grew. Soon, it reached a number high enough to tempt even his allies. When money speaks loudly enough, loyalty begins to crack. And Cullen didn't notice the cracks forming around him. Sheriffs attempted several raids on the gang's hideouts, but none succeeded. The swamps protected Cullen like a living shield, and the dense forests confused even the most experienced trackers. One group of deputies followed, horse tracks toward a clearing, believing they had finally found the gang's camp. But as they approached, gunfire erupted from the trees. The lawmen ducked behind fallen logs and scattered, their hearts pounding. When the smoke cleared, the gang had vanished once again. Another posse attempted a nighttime ambush, creeping toward a flickering campfire deep in the woods. But as they drew closer, they noticed something strange. The fire was burning, but there were no men around it, just empty bottles, fresh footprints, and a single message carved into a tree. To slow lawmen realized they had been watched the entire time. Someone in the gang had spotted them from afar and warned Cullen. The posse returned to town in humiliation. Word spread quickly. More fear, more stories, more pressure on authorities. Every failure made Cullen Baker's legend grow stronger. A strange rumor circulated through the region. Some locals secretly supported Cullen Baker. This wasn't because they liked him or admired his violence. It was because they feared lawmen just as much as criminals. Some Southern families, still bitter about the war, believed Cullen was punishing Union authority. They quietly supplied his gang with food or information, ever openly, never without fear, but enough to help them. This support gave Cullen confidence, too much confidence. He started believing he was invincible, untouchable, a king of his own dark kingdom. But the truth was hidden beneath the surface. He wasn't rising. He was becoming a target. The more famous he became, the more enemies he created. It is often said that outlaw gangs hold together because of loyalty. But in the Cullen Baker gang, loyalty was thin. Fear was what held them together. And fear is fragile. Some members were tired of constantly running and hiding. Others were sick of Cullen's drunken rages. A few began questioning his decisions. And all of them knew about the reward money. Whispers started in the dark. Maybe we should turn him in. He's going to get us killed. If anyone survives, it won't be him. Cullen sensed this shift. His voice grew sharper. His eyes grew colder. His paranoia grew stronger. He watched every man as if expecting betrayal. And in doing so, he pushed them even farther away. The story of the gang's brutality traveled far enough to reach the ears of professional bounty hunters, men who had tracked killers across mountains and deserts. These men didn't fear the swamps. They didn't fear stories. They didn't fear Cullen. They only cared about the reward. For the first time, Cullen faced enemies who were hunting him not out of duty, but out of profit. Men who wouldn't hesitate. Men who knew the tricks of the wilderness. Men who could track a ghost. But even this wasn't the biggest threat to Cullen Baker. His most dangerous enemies weren't strangers. They were riding right beside him, sleep beside him, follow him, fear him. Because when a gang is held together only by fear, it is only a matter of time before that fear turns inward. And Cullen Baker was about to learn that the deadliest danger in his life wasn't the law, it was betrayal. The Cullen Baker gang had reached a strange peak by late 1867. They were feared across 2 states. Their ambushes were legendary. Their name alone could send travelers turning back toward safety. But behind this terrifying strength, something fragile was beginning to crumble. Something the outside world could not see. Inside the gang, the brotherhood was slowly breaking apart. Fear held the gang together. But fear is not glue, it is fire. And the longer it burns, the more it devours everything around it. Every man in the gang felt the heat, and Cullen Baker felt it most of all. At first, the changes were small. A whisper between men that turned quiet when Cullen approached. A suspicious glance during a raid. A few arguments over missing supplies, lost horses, or unequal shares of stolen goods. If the gang had been guided by trust, these little problems might have faded. But under Cullen's growing paranoia, they only grew worse. Cullen believed the world was against him. He believed betrayal was hiding behind every tree. He believed even shadows were watching him. And so, he watched his own men. He questioned them constantly. He accused them of hiding information. He checked their belongings without permission. He punished minor mistakes with screams, and sometimes violence. The men who once followed him out of loyalty now followed him out of survival. Speaking against him meant risking his unpredictable anger. Riding beside him meant dancing near the edge of an active volcano. The gang was no longer a family. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The bounty on Cullen's head had grown large enough to tempt even the bravest outlaw. Rumors said the reward could change a man's life, give him a new start, a new home, a new beginning. This reward poster wasn't just dangerous for Cullen, it was dangerous for anyone who rode with him. Some outlaws saw the reward as a curse. Others saw it as a golden opportunity. One member, a man named Samuel Red Hargrove, began asking quiet questions. How much is the bounty now? Who pays it? What if someone gave Cullen up? Red didn't think Cullen heard him, but Cullen always heard. One night, after a heavy rainstorm, Cullen approached Red by the campfire. The flickering flames revealed the coldness in his eyes. You think too much about money, Cullen said flatly. Red tried to laugh it off. Just talk, Cullen. Nothing serious. Cullen didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just said, talking can get a man killed. Red didn't sleep that night in Neither did anyone else. The message was clear. Cullen was watching, and he was ready to act on the smallest suspicion. As the gang grew more famous, new men joined, hoping to share in the infamy and the stolen goods. But these new recruits didn't respect Cullen like the older members did. They weren't afraid of him, not yet. They joked behind his back. They questioned his orders. They complained about the constant movement, the hunger, the risks. Cullen saw them as threats. They saw him as a reckless captain steering a sinking ship. The older members, caught between loyalty and fear, didn't know who to trust. Some sided with Cullen, others with the newcomers. Soon, the gang had invisible lines drawn across its camp. Cullen's loyalists on one side, the doubters on the other. Every night, tension hung in the air like thick smoke. One wrong word could start a fight. One wrong look could start a war. Whiskey had always been Cullen's escape, but now it was becoming his prison. He drank more often, and when he drank, his temper exploded. He would yell into the woods, firing shots at shadows only he could see. He would accuse men of betrayal with no evidence. He would lecture the gang for hours about loyalty, enemies, and death. The men began avoiding him during his drunken spirals, but there was no escaping a leader who patrolled the camp like a restless ghost. One night, Cullen stumbled into camp after hours, alone in the forest. His clothes were soaked with swamp water, his eyes wide, his gun drawn. "They're coming," he yelled. "The soldiers, the Yankees, they're close." The gang grabbed their weapons and prepared for an ambush, but no soldiers came. No patrol arrived. No enemy appeared. Cullen had imagined it all. When dawn finally broke, the gang realized something terrifying. Their leader was losing his mind, and the question no one dared ask was, if Cullen couldn't tell reality from fear, how long until he turned that fear on them? The first actual attempt to betray Cullen came from a man named Wallace Boone, quiet rider who had joined the gang only months earlier. Boone planned to slip away in the night, bring news of Cullen's location to the nearest Union camp, and claim the reward. He packed his bags. He saddled his horse. He looked over his shoulder one last time, but he didn't know. Cullen had been watching him for hours. As Boone mounted his horse, Cullen appeared from behind a cedar tree, gun in hand. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Boone froze. The forest went silent. Cullen's voice was calm, too calm. "You think you can walk away? You think you can sell me for money? You think you can outrun me?" Boone tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Cullen didn't shoot him. He didn't need to. He dragged Boone back into camp and threw him in front of the others. "Any man who tries to betray me," Cullen said, "will die slow." The gang watched with wide eyes as Cullen fired a shot into the ground beside Boone's head, then ordered him tied to a tree. He left Boone there for a full day. Boone survived, but he never tried to escape again. This moment changed the gang forever. Now betrayal wasn't just a possibility. It was a fear crawling under every man's skin as the gang fractured. As the tension grew, as trust collapsed, Cullen began to feel trapped. He couldn't escape his own paranoia, and he couldn't control the men around him. He wanted absolute loyalty, but loyalty based on fear never lasts. Deep down, Cullen sensed the truth he refused to accept. His gang was slipping away. His power was fading. His enemies were circling. His time was running out. And for the first time in his life, Cullen Baker felt something he had not felt since boyhood. He felt vulnerable, because the danger closing in on him was not coming from the woods or the soldiers or the law. It was coming from the men who rode beside him as the Cullen Baker gang began to fall apart under the weight of fear and suspicion. There was one person who saw Cullen not as a monster, not as a legend, but as a human being, a deeply damaged, troubled, and unpredictable man, yet still a man. Her name was Martha Foster, and without knowing it, she would become the one piece of his life he tried to hold on to, even as the rest of it slipped through his fingers. Cullen had spent years drowning himself in war, violence, and rage. But even the most hardened outlaw feels the ache of loneliness. He watched other men in the gang write letters home, talk about the families they'd lost, or dream about what life might have been if the war hadn't carved everything apart. Cullen didn't talk about dreams, because he didn't think he had the right to have any. But then he met Martha. She was young, smart, a teacher's daughter, someone who lived in a world very different from his. When they first crossed paths in a small settlement near the Arkansas border, Martha didn't see the outlaw. She didn't see the wanted man whose name appeared in newspapers and reward posters. She saw his eyes, tired, restless eyes that held too many ghosts. Cullen didn't know how to respond to kindness. He didn't know how to explain his scars. So he did what he always did. When emotions grew too heavy, he tried to hide behind silence. But Martha didn't let him. Something about him stirred her curiosity. Perhaps she believed she could heal him. Perhaps she believed there was still a piece of good left inside him. Or perhaps she simply didn't understand the danger. Whatever the reason, Martha Foster became the only thing in Cullen's life that wasn't made of blood and fear. Cullen began visiting Martha in secret. At first, he arrived quietly, late at night, keeping his horse hidden and his gun beneath his coat. Martha worried about the risks, but he reassured her in ways she didn't expect. "I'll never hurt you," he told her, and strangely, she believed him. Their conversation stretched long into the night. Cullen spoke more to her than he had spoken to anyone since the war. He told her things no one else knew. His fear of losing control, his memories of gunfire in the dark, his nightmares of the battles he fought, his desire for peace, but his inability to find it. Martha listened, and slowly she began to love him. Not the outlaw, not the violent gang leader, but the broken man behind the legend. But love is dangerous when the world stands against you. Martha's family hated Cullen. Neighbors warned her to stay away. Friends begged her not to trust him, and yet she did. Against all reason, against all fear, she trusted him. Against everyone's wishes, Martha and Cullen married quietly. No celebration, no joy. Just two people hoping that love might save at least one soul from a lifetime of violence. For a brief moment, Cullen believed he could change. He believed he could leave the gang. He believed he could build a small life, a quiet life, a safe life. But dreams don't survive long in the world of outlaws. Everywhere Cullen went, trouble followed. Whether he wanted it or not, his gang still needed him. Enemies still hunted him. The bounty on his head still grew. And Cullen's paranoia, the same paranoia that had shattered his gang, now began to creep into his marriage. He questioned strangers. Martha talked to. He studied her family's expressions too closely. He turned cold whenever she mentioned traveling or visiting relatives. Martha saw the change. She felt the fear returning to him. She watched him slip back toward the darkness he tried so hard to escape. She tried to hold him. She tried to comfort him. She tried to remind him he wasn't alone. But Cullen was a man who didn't know how to be saved. Martha's family grew deeply suspicious of Cullen. They saw his wild eyes, his trembling hands, the gun he never removed from his belt. They heard the rumors spreading across towns, the raids, the ambushes, the killings. They were terrified for Martha. Her stepfather, Morgan Foster, warned her, "That man will bring death to this house." But Martha argued. She insisted Cullen could change. She insisted he was trying. She insisted everyone deserved forgiveness. Her family didn't believe her. They didn't believe Cullen's promises. And over time, they stopped believing she was safe. Cullen noticed their stares. He noticed their whispers. He noticed the doors locked earlier at night, the windows closed faster, the conversations that grew quiet when he entered the room, and the fear inside him twisted into suspicion. Even while Cullen tried to live peacefully with Martha, the gang refused to let him go. They visited him unexpectedly. They asked for help in raids. They demanded leadership. They reminded him of the blood they still owed him. Cullen tried to refuse them, but the gang saw refusal as weakness. Some members believed Cullen had gone soft. Others believed Martha was turning him against them. A few believed that capturing Cullen themselves could earn them the reward money. This was the most dangerous shift of all. His own men now saw him as a target. Cullen sensed it. He felt it in the way their voices changed. He felt it in the way they looked at Martha. He felt it in the way the forest sounded different when they rode behind him. The gang he once led had become a pack of wolves circling their wounded leader. Martha loved her husband, but she feared what he was becoming. She saw him pacing at night with a loaded pistol. She saw him jumping at every sound. She saw him waking from nightmares drenched in sweat. She saw the violence in his eyes returning. Her family noticed too. They whispered to each other behind closed doors. They talked about protecting Martha. They talked about protecting themselves. And slowly, silently, they reached a decision that would change everything. They believed the only way to save their daughter was to remove Cullen Baker from their lives forever. By the end of 1868, Cullen was living in a house filled with love and fear, surrounded by allies who feared him, and enemies who pretended to be family. His gang was plotting behind his back. His in-laws were quietly planning something darker. His wife was torn between the man he wanted to be and the man he had become. Cullen Baker's world was shrinking. His fate was tightening like a rope, and he didn't even realize the storm forming around him, because the man who once feared every shadow never thought to fear the people standing right beside him. The year was turning cold, and with every new sunrise, Cullen Baker felt the world closing in around him. The once fearsome outlaw who terrified towns, soldiers, and travelers was no longer the unstoppable force people believed him to be. His legend still ruled the newspapers, but inside, Cullen felt himself becoming smaller, more nervous, more unsettled, more desperate, and everyone around him could sense it. The gang, his wife, her family, the entire region, to the outside world, Cullen Baker was still a monster in the woods. But inside the walls of his small home, he was a man on the edge. Cullen's growing distance from his gang was more than just emotional, it was dangerous. They saw him retreating into family life. They saw him becoming unpredictable. They saw a leader who no longer spent his nights planning raids, but staring into the fire with hollow eyes. And worst of all, they saw the bounty on his head grow. The reward posters now offered more money than any outlaw in the region had ever seen. Enough to start a new life. Enough to disappear forever. Enough to tempt even the loyal. The gang whispered among themselves. He's weak. He's scared. He's slipping. If we don't act, someone else will. Men who once followed Cullen into gunfire now began to calculate their chances of living without him. Riders stayed quiet around him, watching him too closely. His closest followers spoke less, avoided his eyes, and kept their hands near their guns. Cullen noticed every glance, every whisper, every hand twitched, and that only fed the paranoia growing inside him. The gang that once protected him had become the threat he feared most. While Cullen battled fear outside, he faced a different kind of storm inside his own home. Martha tried to hold on to the man she loved, but Cullen had changed again. The warmth he showed her in their early marriage had cooled. His gentle moments were fewer, replaced by long silences and sudden bursts of anger. He slept with a loaded pistol beneath the pillow. He checked the windows 3 times before bed. He stood on the porch for hours, scanning the tree line. He walked through the house at night with a lantern and a weapon. Martha watched him with growing worry. Each day she felt him drifting further away, not toward the gang, not toward freedom, but toward something darker. Cullen didn't explain his fears. He didn't trust his words anymore. He barely trusted himself. He only said one thing to Martha again and again. They're coming for me. At first she thought he meant soldiers or bounty hunters, but Cullen meant something else. He meant everyone. The gang, the law, his enemies, his own doubts, and without realizing it, he also meant her family. Inside the Foster household, fear was turning into hatred. They saw Martha fading, her joy slipping away, her laughter dimming, her voice becoming small and strained. They blamed Cullen, and they blamed him completely. Her stepfather, Morgan Foster, was a strong man with a sharp mind. He loved Martha fiercely, and he could not bear to see her married to someone who brought danger to their door. He had seen the bounty posters. He had heard stories from neighbors. He had watched Cullen lose control. He feared Cullen would either get Martha killed or harm her himself in one of his unpredictable rages. The family whispered behind closed doors, always checking to make sure Cullen wasn't near. He will destroy her. He will drag us all into his madness. He will bring violence here. And finally, we have to stop him. It was not a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in desperation. They believed killing Cullen Baker was the only way to save their daughter. Cullen began to notice something strange in the Foster home. They didn't leave him alone with Martha as often. They locked doors quietly at night. They whispered in the next room and stopped when he entered. They watched him with expressions he couldn't fully understand, a mixture of fear, suspicion, and something colder. They were afraid of him, and they were planning something. Cullen felt it. He felt the tension every time he stepped inside. He felt the silence press against his ears. He felt the eyes watching him, not with curiosity or concern, but with calculation. It gnawed at him, fed his paranoia, kept him awake long into the night. Cullen had escaped death in ambushes, gunfights, drunken brawls, and chaotic raids. But now, the danger was quiet, slow, and creeping like poison slipping into a cup. He was a hunted man. He knew it. He felt it. But what he didn't know was that the people hunting him were not soldiers, not bounty hunters, not rival gangs. It was the people sitting across from him at the dinner table. The people offering him bread. The people telling him they loved him. And in that final season of his life, Cullen did something unusual for him. He stayed in one place. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't return to the swamps to fight another day. It was the first time he chose stillness, and it was the choice that allowed the trap to fully close around him. As winter approached, Cullen's world shrank to a small cabin, a frightened wife, suspicious in-law, and a gang ready to tear itself apart. The trees outside were bare, bending in the cold wind. The river ran dark and silent. The nights grew longer and quieter, pressing in on all sides. Cullen Baker, the legendary outlaw, the swamp fox of the Sulphur River, was unknowingly walking into the final chapter of his life, not with gunfire, not with ambushes, not with a heroic last stand, but with a dinner invitation, a glass of warm liquor, a false sense of peace. The people closest to him were planning a night that would change history, and Cullen, blinded by fear, whiskey, and exhaustion, never saw it coming. Winter settled over the border country with a cold, heavy silence. The trees stood bare, the river moved like black glass, and the wind seemed to whisper warnings through the branches. It was the kind of season where the world felt still too still, and in that stillness, Cullen Baker made the worst mistake of his life. He stopped moving. For a man who survived by running, hiding, ambushing, and outsmarting everyone around him, staying in one place was the same as leaving the door open for death. But Cullen was tired. Tired of the gang. Tired of the fear. Tired of the accusations in every passing glance. Tired of the nightmares that never let him sleep. He wanted peace, even if he didn't know how to find it. And that longing made him vulnerable inside the foster home. Martha desperately clung to the hope that her husband could be saved. She believed a quiet life might calm his anger. She believed love might soften the edges of his fear, but she didn't realize that Cullen's presence was tearing her family apart. Her stepfather, Morgan Foster, watched Cullen with the wary eyes of a hunter observing a wounded animal, dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of snapping at any moment. Her relatives whispered about the raids, the killings, the rumors that followed Cullen everywhere. They spoke of the bounty hunters coming closer. They spoke of Union soldiers who would burn their home to the ground if they believed Cullen was inside. And worst of all, they spoke of Martha's safety. To them, Cullen wasn't a husband. He was a threat wrapped in skin. Slowly they came to a dark conclusion. If Cullen lived, Martha might not. And so, in secret, behind locked doors and lowered voices, the Foster family made a plan. A plan so quiet, so simple, it felt almost harmless when spoken aloud. We must get rid of him. On a cold evening in December 1869, the Foster home prepared for a small gathering. The table was set, a fire burned in the hearth. The air smelled of warm food and fresh bread. It looked peaceful, it looked safe, it looked welcoming, but beneath the surface, tension twisted like barbed wire. Cullen felt uneasy the moment he stepped inside. The house was too quiet, the smiles were too forced, the voices too gentle. But he was exhausted physically, mentally, and spiritually. And exhaustion is a dangerous companion for an outlaw. Morgan Foster greeted him with unusual warmth. Come in, Cullen. You should rest. You're safe here. Safe. The word felt strange. It felt wrong. But Cullen wanted to believe it. He stepped inside, unaware that this would be the last door he ever walked through. Later that night, as everyone gathered near the warmth of the fire, Morgan poured drinks for the family. Cullen watched him carefully. At first, but the man's expression remained calm and pleasant. "This will warm your bones," Morgan said, offering Cullen a glass. Cullen hesitated, just for a second. Then he took it. He was tired of suspicion, tired of questioning every gesture, tired of living like an animal hunted from every direction. He lifted the glass. What Cullen did not know was that the drink he held had been laced, carefully, quietly, by the very people who had invited him in, a poison that would weaken him, confuse him, slow him down just long enough for what would come next. Cullen swallowed the drink. It burned warmly in his chest. Then he coughed again. His vision began to blur. The voices around him grew distant. The shadows grew darker. His hands trembled. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Cullen tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him. He fell onto one knee, gripping the side of the table as the room spun around him. Martha rushed forward, her face pale with shock. Cullen, what's wrong?" But Cullen couldn't answer. His tongue felt thick, his mouth dry. His heartbeat thundered inside his ears like distant drums. Morgan and several men stepped toward him, their faces no longer warm, but cold and determined. They did not run to help him. They stepped closer to finish what they had started. Cullen understood everything in that moment. The whispers, the stares, the locked doors, the forced smiles. This had never been a dinner. This had been a trap. He reached for his gun. His fingers brushed the handle, but the poison stole his strength. His hand slipped. His weapon clattered to the floor. One of the men kicked it away. Cullen looked at Martha, eyes wide with confusion and heartbreak. She looked back at him, tears filling her eyes. She didn't know. She hadn't been part of the plan. She hadn't known the truth until it was too late. "Martha," Cullen whispered weakly. She reached for him, but one of her relatives held her back. "Leave him," the man ordered. And in that moment, Cullen saw everything clearly, not through paranoia, not through anger, but through the sharp, painful lens of truth. He had feared the wrong enemies all along. The ones who killed him weren't outlaws, weren't soldiers, weren't bounty hunters. They were family. The poison was working fast. Cullen's vision flickered. His heartbeat slowed. He gasped for breath, trying desperately to pull himself to his feet. Morgan Forster raised his weapon. For a brief moment, the world held its breath. Cullen weak, trembling. Betrayal looked up at his father-in-law with a mixture of fury, disbelief, and sorrow. Then came the gunshot. A single blast tore through the quiet home. Cullen Baker collapsed to the floor, his life leaking away into the wood beneath him. The most feared outlaw of the Sulphur River region died not in a heroic shootout, not in a dusty street, not surrounded by loyal gang members. He died on a wooden floor in a house that pretended to offer refuge, killed by people who believed they were saving the woman he loved. Word of Cullen Baker's death spread fast. Some said he had been ambushed by soldiers. Others said rival outlaws gunned him down. Some swore a bounty hunter infiltrated his home. But the truth was far simpler and far more tragic. He died because the people closest to him believed there was no other way. His body was carried away quietly. No songs, no last words, no farewell from the gang he once led. The legend of Cullen Baker ended not with thunder, but with whispers. Whispers of betrayal, whispers of fear, whispers of a man who could escape anyone except those he trusted. The night Cullen Baker died, the wind outside the Foster home carried no echo of gunfire, no shouts of battle, no thunder of horses. His death was quiet too, quiet for a man whose life had been built on chaos. As the poison settled in his veins and the smoke of the final gunshot drifted into the cold air, history changed in a single heartbeat. The most feared outlaw of the Sulphur River region was gone, but his story was far from over. At dawn, the forest was still. Frost clung to the branches. The river moved slowly, as if it sensed something heavy had fallen from the world. Inside the house, the Foster family stood over Cullen's still body. None of them spoke, none of them celebrated. Even Morgan Foster, who had fired the fatal shot, looked shaken. Violence, even for a righteous cause. Leaves a stain. Martha, pale with grief, knelt beside her dead husband. She pressed her trembling hand against his cold cheek. Her tears fell silently, soaking into his shirt. She whispered, "You could have been different. You tried." Her family tried to pull her away, but she refused to move at first. She stayed there until the morning light fell on Cullen's face. The man she had loved, the man she had feared, the man she had tried desperately to save from himself. Cullen Baker had lived like a storm, loud, wild, furious, but he died like a man's mole, broken, tired. Word of his death traveled faster than any posse, faster than any newspaper. Travelers carried the tale across river crossings, through taverns, over dry roads, and deep into Texas. By midday, entire communities were whispering, "Cullen Baker is dead. They poisoned him." It was his wife's family. No. It was bounty hunters. No. It was soldiers. No. His own gang betrayed him. The truth twisted into a dozen versions within hours. Some claimed Cullen never died, that the body in the Foster home wasn't really him, that he escaped again and would return for revenge. Others insisted he had been killed in a shootout with 20 men. Some swore a bullet couldn't kill him, so he must have died by witchcraft of fate. But the real story, the quiet, tragic betrayal, was almost too ordinary for the legend. People wanted to believe, and legends rarely die the same way real men do. Far from the Foster home, deep in the Sulphur River bottoms, members of the Cullen Baker gang received the news. With a silence that spread like fog. Red Hargrove, the man Cullen once threatened by the fire, stared into the trees for a long time before speaking. "So that's it," he muttered. "The swamp fox is gone." Some of the gang felt relief. Some felt fear. A few felt sorrow. But all of them felt the same truth pressing down on their chests. Without Cullen Baker, there was no Cullen Baker gang. He had been the fire that drove them, the force that united them, the rage that steered them. And with him gone, the gang became nothing more than a group of frightened men with no direction. Within a week, they scattered. Some fled to Louisiana. Some tried to hide in Arkansas. Others attempted to return home and pretend they had never taken part in the bloodshed. The gang dissolved like smoke in the cold air, but their crimes remained. Their reputation remained. And the fear they had spread across 2 states lingered long after their disappearance. A few days after Cullen's death, a group of Union soldiers and local lawmen arrived at the Foster property. They had been tracking rumors of Cullen's location and hoped to catch him at last. Instead, they found a freshly dug grave. Morgan Foster came out to meet them with a gun on his hip and his jaw set. He told them the story plainly. Theirs. No need to chase him anymore. He's dead. I shot him after he threatened my family. The officers exchanged looks. Some doubted him. Others were simply relieved. They demanded proof. Morgan uncovered the grave, just enough for the officers to identify Cullen's body. The unmistakable face, the scars, the known features, all confirmed it. The soldiers nodded. The nightmare was finally over. One officer said quietly, "The government will want the details, but the territory will sleep easier now." And he was right. For the first time in years, the Sulphur River region felt a sliver of peace, while the world breathed a sigh of relief. Martha Baker carried a weight no one else could understand. People judged her. They whispered behind her back. They whispered that she should have known better. They whispered that she married a monster. But they didn't see what she saw. The moments when Cullen tried to change, the fear in his eyes when he thought someone would hurt her, the soft way he spoke her name when he wasn't angry or drunk or haunted. She mourned not just the man he was, but the man he could have been. For months, she visited his grave in secret. She placed flowers on the dirt, whispered apologies, whispered forgiveness, whispered memories only the two of them shared. Eventually, she remarried. Eventually, she rebuilt her life. Eventually, she moved on. But a part of her heart never forgot. The outlaw whose war never ended. Even with Cullen gone and the gang scattered, the legend of the Cullen Baker gang refused to fade. In fact, his death made the legend grow even stronger. Storytellers in saloons exaggerated the truth. He killed 30 soldiers alone. He walked through gunfire like a ghost. They had to poison him because bullets couldn't kill. Him, travelers told children to behave, or Cullen Baker will get you. Songs were written about him. Pamphlets retold his life, twisting facts into drama. Newspapers printed his name again and again. Some painted him as a hero who fought against federal control. Others painted him as a brutal murderer. But most agreed on one thing. Cullen Baker was unforgettable. He became one of the first Wild West outlaws to reach mythic status years before Jesse James. Billy the Kid, or Butch Cassidy, filled the pages of dime novels. The world needed legends, and legends often grow from the darkest soil, behind the stories. Behind the myth, behind the fame, there was only a broken man shaped by violence, a boy raised in conflict, a soldier hardened by war, a leader driven by anger, a husband seeking peace he didn't know how to keep, an outlaw trapped by his own reputation, a man destroyed by those he trusted most. Cullen Baker did not die a hero. He did not die a villain. He died as something far more human, a man who could not escape the consequences of who he had become. His grave grew cold. The gang vanished into history. The Sulphur River flowed on, washing away footprints, but not memories. Yet the echo of his life, the echo of a man who lived too fast, fought too hard, and trusted too late still lingers in the stories of the old frontier, because legends never truly die. They simply fade into the shadows, waiting to be told again.